Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalugin here with another big week of World War III analysis. So much going on. I mean, obviously everybody's still reeling from the Trump press conference with Netanyahu about, the whole wrench thrown into the whole Palestine-Gaza issue with his proposal to make Gaza into a U.S. occupied zone, to turn it into some international French Riviera style sort of thing. So we're going to break down all of that. We're going to break down the new escalations on the Syrian-Lebanon border as pro-Hezbollah clans are fighting with the Syrian army there. We're going to talk about Israel's plans for getting rid of the Gazans, sending them to potentially Egypt or Jordan, Israel's new operations in the West Bank, as well as the sort of stalled potential negotiations. It seems that Putin is not really reciprocating, reaching out to Trump. It seems that he is willing to keep the special military operation going, which, as Dmitry mentioned to me off air, has now been going on longer than the First World War, before the Bolshevik Revolution was able to overthrow the Tsar. So very, very long, long legacy indeed that is going to be had here from the special military operation. We're going to get into the latest stuff in Africa, as well as some church news, among EU updates, a whole host of other things. The U.S. aid story, of course, is very big. So a lot of things to discuss this week. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. It's been an insane week. And, every week has its own sort of peculiar flavor and taste. And this week, I think, and besides, of course, Kanye West returning to X Twitter, it's been very eventful in terms of Netanyahu, of course, visiting Donald J. Trump and giving one of the most insane press conferences alongside Donald J. Trump. And you'd think perhaps Netanyahu would say something incredibly hawkish and really catch the headlines, but Donald Trump actually one-upped him. And actually, in some ways, there were even speculations that perhaps Donald Trump even surprised the Prime Minister of Israel himself, with this proclamation that the United States will take on the mighty burden, the white man's burden, to rebuild Gaza and, in fact, improve it. This is according to potentially even Jared Kushner's old plan, which he proposed during the Trump's previous administration, but amplified and escalated to some sort of incredible position. And of course, Trump has been stating throughout his entire election campaign that Gaza has been essentially turned into a parking lot. This does somewhat align with St. Paisius' prophecy that he said that Gaza will be turned essentially into a stadium of sorts by the Israelis. And what's interesting is, by stadium, I think it's on one hand, it has been turned into this world opera, like this theater of everybody watching what happens in Gaza and watching the Israeli war crimes, first and foremost.
Yeah, watching an open-air refugee camp,
exactly.
get assaulted.
And on the other hand, it's a stadium as in like Colosseum. Exactly, it's a slaughterhouse. And maybe even a stadium for entertainment and a futuristic Riviera, as you said, that Trump may build here. So it's interesting how the prophecies of the saints literally align with real politics that's happening in real time. And of course, these weird high-end proclamations by Donald J. Trump himself. And I think we can perhaps say that he was a bit hyperbolic in this particular press conference. He did, of course, push in like a good servant Netanyahu's chair, and there was all that weird symbolism. Of course, the gifting of the golden pages, I think we'll discuss in a moment. But the most surprising thing was this assertion that the US will, of course, invest both troops, money, as well as put at risk the lives of American servants and agitate Sunni Muslims to a new extent, similar to during the War on Terror and prior to that, the wars, Desert Storm, the wars against Iraq, the invasion of Afghanistan. All of these events, of course, triggered and agitated Muslim extremists throughout the Middle East. This is important because, not all Muslims, of course, turn into terrorists. As we know now, we're all educated here, listeners of the show. But these additional incursions into the Middle East, all they do is agitate psychopathic fundamentalist cults within Islam, especially in Sunni Islam, like the cults that took over Syria and, of course, overthrew Dr. Assad's government in December last year. And, of course, the presence of so-called Christian Americans, these majority Protestants, of course, and Zionists in the Gaza Strip, these white, blonde, Aryan-looking crusaders. This is what, of course, Hamas will probably need to use as propaganda in order to bolster this opposition in the Gaza Strip, will only agitate the Islamic world again against the US, potentially even preparing the world, if there are, say, fights between Hamas and the US troops in the Gaza Strip, you'll prepare this potential escalation point that will lead to a greater Iran-US war. God forbid, but this is what a lot of geopolitical analysts have been predicting for 2025, and this is what the mandate of the people will be used for. And of course, Israel, I think, generally speaking, even though there have been theories that, Donald J. Trump simply outsmarted Netanyahu and he wants to control the situation, I think in reality, it's simply the Americans taking on this burden of rebuilding a place which they did not destroy. If anything, the US should be pressuring Israel to use its own taxpayer dollars and even some of the aid that they've been receiving from the United States to rebuild the homes, the hospitals of the Gazans whose land and essentially whose territory they invaded after October 7th last year. And it's true, not all Palestinian people in Gaza are members of Hamas. So you cannot simply swoop them all under the same organization name and label them all as terrorists. And that's, I think, very inappropriate. On the other hand, Conrad, the question of Hamas, Donald J. Trump has already mentioned that as soon as hostilities stop in the Gaza Strip, that is when the US will come in. So the US won't be entertaining an entrance into the Gaza Strip to rebuild it whilst the fighting is still ongoing. But Hamas is not looking to, under Mohammed Sinwar and other leaders who essentially have already family members killed by the Israeli Zionists over the last few years, they're not interested in giving up control of Palestinian Gaza to either the Israeli authorities nor to some sort of foreign invader such as the United States. So essentially what Trump is saying is that the war will continue in Gaza, potentially into the future, until Hamas is completely wiped out. I think this is the main message. Hamas is not going to migrate to Syria, which is unfriendly to Hamas at the moment. Well, I guess theoretically speaking, because Hamas has been somewhat supported by Iran. Jordan will not take any Hamas operatives. Egypt most certainly will not take Hamas operatives. Egypt is very anti-Hamas, anti-Muslim Brotherhood, which Hamas has very deep links to. And so this does cause this big conundrum of exactly what will the US control of Gaza come to in reality, because Trump, again, in his sort of art of the deal type negotiation, Conrad, it's almost like he's setting the bar very high initially, and then he'll, of course, negotiate it down. So perhaps US involvement in Gaza will be less severe than what he stated at this insane press conference. But in any case, this is very, very dangerous and very bad rhetoric, I think, for all Americans. Even it places American lives at risk, I think, in the greater Middle East, because it agitates that Sunni Muslim, already very vengeful aspiration to rid Israel of the Zionists. But again, the Sunni Muslim world views, I think, US largely as these supporters of Zionism and of course, these like this new British Empire, which has occupied former Muslim lands and now seeks to dominate them even further. It's very, very bad optics, I believe.
I mean, I think this proposal by Trump, like you said, it was sort of a negotiation tactic, for better or for worse. Yes, we did see Trump obviously pull out Netanyahu's chair. Netanyahu gave him the golden pager, which is just a bizarre gift. I remember when Putin gave Trump the soccer ball, we had to entertain days of discourse about if it was bugged, if it was going to do something. Meanwhile, Netanyahu gives a golden version of what was a secret bomb device to Trump. And of course, everyone just thinks, oh, isn't that clever? Ha, 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 ha. But of course, the throwing out comment, rather what people thought was just a random comment from Trump, which, I mean, it kind of was. I don't know if his team was even briefed on that. Clearly, he didn't necessarily tell Netanyahu he was going to say that. Of course, Netanyahu referred to Trump as the best friend Israel has ever had in the White House of any president. I guess that includes the presidents that actually created the state of Israel. But the crazy thing about all of this is that the way Netanyahu responded, and now that Ben-Gvir is about to rejoin the government, it's clear that the Israelis see this as sort of an emboldening of their position. Obviously, Trump has said that Hamas must be completely destroyed. We know that the 3 parts of the ceasefire deal that came about, only one of those was agreed to by Israel. Within a few months' time, likely the fighting will have resumed again. We heard this from Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister. Ben-Gvir, like I said, is talking about wanting to rejoin the government now that things have gone this way. But Trump was, in some capacity, I think, trying to throw a wrench into the whole thing, whether it be to Israel, whether it be to the Saudis, to the Emiratis. And I think in many ways, Trump sees the potential of an Emirati or Saudi-run state. He sees the future of an independent Palestine and realizes, obviously, the Jews don't want the independent Palestine, so he can't say that. But he throws this crazy idea out there. Of course, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, they all respond. Egypt and Jordan saying they have no interest in taking the Palestinians, which that was Trump's plan. He claims he wants to expel 1.7 plus million Palestinians to Egypt, Jordan. Some are saying Morocco. There was even a proposal that said Puntland, which is a part of Somalia, which, look, I get that the Palestinians might not be Europeans, but I don't think anybody wants to go to Somalia, man. Like that's just cruel. But I think the plan itself, I agree. I don't think Trump actually has a plan to turn Gaza into Puerto Rico in the Middle East. But I think it was this sort of Trumpian tactic where you kind of throw something crazy out there, get everybody off foot, so then you can be on steady ground, assess the landscape, and then what might have been more reach goals are now very much attainable because this whole new thing had been thrown out there that now everybody is thinking about. And again, Saudi Arabia totally rejecting any kind of normalization with Israel if a Palestinian state is not included in that. And I think Trump in many ways is pressuring the Gulf state, Saudi Arabia, to take on more responsibility for the Gaza situation. And Israel, ultimately, if it could get Israel normal relations with Saudi Arabia, I think Israel would be willing to collaborate with them in Gaza because that would allow for the full completion of the IMEC corridor, of course, the pipelines from India up through the Persian Gulf, through the Emirates, through Saudi Arabia, into Gaza, and Israel out into the Tamar oil gas fields that have been found off the coast there, also near the ones nearby Cyprus. And this would ultimately take it to Greece through Europe and very much counter China's Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of the other Eurasian pipeline systems that are more dominated by multipolar factions. But as far as what I think is going to happen in the coming days in Gaza, I do see the ceasefire collapse. Obviously, that's inevitable. I don't think that it's sustainable in its current form. We're also seeing major Israeli operations in the northern West Bank. New towns are being stormed by Israeli armored bulldozers, as well as tanks and just general IDF Shin Bet forces, which, again, that's just part of the price tag that Miriam Adelson got for Trump's election, which is unfortunate to see. And now we're seeing the Israeli Defense Minister, Israel Katz. On Thursday, he ordered the military to prepare for the voluntary departure of Palestinians from Gaza, as Israeli officials are hoping to pursue ethnic cleansing following Trump's proposals for the enclave. And Trump, again, it wasn't just the press conference where he said this. He reiterated on Truth Social very recently. He said the Gaza Strip will be turned over to the United States by Israel at the conclusion of the fighting. The president's comment suggests he expects Israel's genocidal war to restart, which would be supported with U.S. military aid. And so we're obviously going to talk about other U.S. aid-related things that have been defunded. Unfortunately, Israel, Egypt, Ukraine as well have not been any of those defunded entities. It appears that not only is Israel, having its carved-out exception for Trump's foreign aid freeze, they're even having the American legislature start to approve up to $7 billion aid packages that include huge munitions, huge bombs, all sorts of precision-guided missiles, air defense, all this sorts of stuff. So the full support of Israel by the United States, unfortunately, is increasing. Of course, Biden, claimed to sort of go both ways. The Democrats try to claim they're up for the Palestinians, but obviously the whole year-long war in Gaza unfolded under Biden, and now Trump is escalating these things. And it appears that obviously the legislature in America, the cabinet, are all fully behind this plan. And obviously, the plan that has been unfolding since October 7th, obviously as this stuff unfolds, it only confirms the sort of hypothesis that October 7th was obviously allowed to happen. There had already been intelligence leaks, and then it was allowed to go and unfold for the purpose of restoring Greater Israel and making the Greater Israel plan real, which is unfolding in every direction that Israel wants to expand right now. And this is more confirmed by a story. This is from the Cradle. It says, ex-Israeli war chief confirms issuing Hannibal directive to kill own civilian soldiers on the 7th of October. And of course, Yoav Gallant, who was dismissed by Netanyahu to much chagrin of more moderate people in Israel, he has been doing these interviews. And he said, this is from the Cradle, former Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has acknowledged ordering the army to use the Hannibal directive to kill Israeli citizens on October 7th. During an interview with Israel's Channel 12 on the 7th of February, Gallant admitted to ordering the controversial protocol that involves killing captives along with their captors. When asked whether an order was given to implement the Hannibal directive, Gallant responded, I think that tactically in some places it was given, and in other places it was not given, and that is a problem. Israel claims Hamas killed roughly 1,100 Israeli civilians and soldiers during its attack on Israeli settlements on military bases on October 7th as part of Operation Al-Aqsa. However, Israeli forces killed large numbers of their own civilians and soldiers during the attack. The army dispatched attack helicopters, drones, and tanks on its own territory to respond to the attack, killing not only Hamas fighters, but Israeli civilians and soldiers that the Palestinian fighters attempted to take as captives back to Gaza. Israeli helicopters also killed Israeli civilians at the Nova Festival, which took place near the Reim military base. Gallant also criticized former police security minister Itamar Ben-Gvir for his provocative storming of the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, stating that it was like detonating the situation. Gallant made the comments in his first interview since being dismissed as defense minister in November. And then another major Israeli official, Israeli Reserve pilot Colonel Nof Erez, he described the Israeli army's response to October 7th as mass Hannibal, implying the Hannibal directive. And he said, we don't know whether the hostages were hit once. Gunships and drones started to fire at the fence once they saw the mass traffic through the fence that was coming in and coming out. So he's admitting that they were just randomly firing at crowds of people that obviously included civilians, which again, I've seen footage that completely verifies this. I remember in the aftermath of October 7th, everybody was posting this, but of course, like everything else, the Israelis cover it up to maintain their narrative. But it's clear now that, again, the entire episode that was October 7th, again, while I'm not implying that certain Hamas operatives, Yahya Sinwar, these people that actually planned it, I'm not necessarily saying that they were being directed by Israel, but there were clearly intelligence leaks that were known about. Netanyahu, I'm sure, deliberately gave stand-down orders. And of course, then this Hannibal directive was put out because they saw an opportunity to really, really expand their operations. And it all coincides with Netanyahu's legal persecution, which, again, people need to remember, the moment he's not prime minister anymore, he's probably getting arrested and going to jail and getting very heavily prosecuted. So not only do the hardliners that are very afraid of the 80-year curse of a Jewish state that is fast approaching want to shore up Israel's defenses, expand Israel's borders into Syria, Lebanon, the West Bank, Egypt, probably Saudi Arabia, Turkey as well, all these places. They need that, as well as, of course, Netanyahu's political future. It's a very convenient situation for him to being now presented as Israel's savior in its sort of final hour of need, while he is also under persecution by the legal entities of his state. So I'd love your thoughts on all of that, Dimitri.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, there was an Israeli minister who literally didn't just say the Palestinians should be forcefully, they should have this exodus to, say, the neighboring countries of Jordan, which of course has issues with a sort of very militant Palestinian faction moving in, of course, into the land. We have to keep in mind more than half of Jordanian citizens are technically Palestinians, right? But Palestinians did have an internal clash within Jordan against the former king of Jordan in 1970 and 1971. This was the so-called Black September, when Yasser Arafat essentially went against Abdullah II's father. And it was an interesting sort of clash. Again, the 1970s were a very sort of violent period of Middle Eastern history in that particular part of the land. But most importantly is that, I mean, the Queen of Jordan herself is, Queen Rania is a Palestinian, ethnically and by heritage. So she's always been kind of an outspoken person for Palestinian rights. But in a similar way to Mahmoud Abbas, she hasn't been, of course, as militant as maybe some of the very pro-Palestinian, anti-Israeli factions within the Gaza Strip, for example. Most importantly, the Egyptians as well do not want the Palestinian refugees or even any sort of mass Palestinian exodus, despite the fact that they have been building, and perhaps it's already constructed fully, this refugee camp in the Sinai Peninsula. I don't think that refugee camp is able to hold 1.8 million or 1.9 million Palestinians. And this is the interesting discrepancy, Conrad, because if you check any sort of general demographic website, even through Google, you'll note that the Palestinian population in Gaza is roughly just over 2 million, 2.1, 2.2 million people. However, Donald J. Trump in that press conference, he did mention that the Gazan population was 1.8 million. So what happened to the few 100,000 Palestinians? An open question. It's probably they fell victim to the humanitarian crisis and the genocide that was enacted upon them after October 7th by the IDF and the Israeli Air Force. And the relentless bombardments day in and day out, of course, the 50 to 100 Palestinians, if not more, dying every single day for the past almost year and a half. So it's been quite an engaging period of time, I think, and for the Palestinians, this big strife. And I would say there are probably a lot of Palestinians who do want to seek refuge elsewhere simply because their land, their home has been turned into this sort of field of Armageddon on which these essentially US-backed and US technology-built planes are wreaking absolute havoc, and there's no accountability whatsoever. There's no respite until, of course, now this apparent peace deal between the Gaza Palestinians and Hamas and the United States, which I think has given some time of peace and maybe even time to actually grieve the losses of their relatives, because I'm sure almost every single Palestinian family has lost at least one, perhaps two members, because you remember, all these clans are all related. The Palestinians these people have a lot of children. There's a lot of the tragedy of the Palestinian crisis over the last year has been, I think we'll only appreciate the depth of it when there are actual proper articles, books published about it in the next few years. At the moment, it's even hard to sort of comprehend the entire thing. But as I said, the Israeli minister, he's openly stated that Palestinians should be sent to countries like Spain, Ireland, these less wealthy countries of the European Union, in order to culturally enrich them on one hand, right? And of course, enact the Kalogi plan. On the other hand, to, of course, cause more ethnic strife in these European countries. Of course, this is the thing he didn't say out loud, but we recognize that the international Talmudic network, of course, works on these multifaceted approaches. Of course, they multitask and they make sure that they tick multiple boxes as they push their strategies and tactics across in sort of their domination of the world. On the other hand, of course, the call for Palestinians to get rid of Hamas, I think, is really strong. It's similar to the pressure being put on the Lebanese government, Conrad, that, of course, they should do away with Hezbollah controlling the territory south of the Litani River. There's almost an analogy there. Both Israel and the US is trying to pressure the respective majority ethnic groups, both the Gazan Palestinians and the Lebanese people, from pressuring and pushing out their respective militant factions, Hezbollah and Hamas. It's very obvious, kind of on the nose. And Netanyahu himself has, openly stated it's quite provocative, actually. And in some ways, it's kind of like a jab in the guts for MBS, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, especially since most likely in the next few years, he will inherit the title of King of Saudi Arabia from his father, who most likely will pass. His health isn't doing too well, which is why MBS is the main spokesperson for that country. Netanyahu has stated, well, all the Palestinians can simply move to Saudi Arabia. The population isn't too large. There's a lot of land in the desert there, in the Arabian Peninsula. They are Sunni Muslims. They're welcome to, of course, all migrate to Saudi Arabia and they'll find peace there. Of course, this is just another element of ethnic cleansing. And Netanyahu kind of just says it out loud because he's really not afraid. I think he's happy being the villain of the 21st century at the moment. He's trying to overcome other controversial figures like Osama bin Laden, George W. Bush, etc. So Netanyahu, I think, is really living out this particular dream. But as you mentioned, Conrad, the entire Hannibal Directive, the potential Israeli agent infiltration of Hamas, as well as other Palestinian organizations in the Gaza Strip, this was a real reality because the Israelis, they don't all look European. There are Israelis who appear and have even intermarried with local peoples throughout the ages. And so they have actually infiltrated the Gaza Strip. The Russian political commentators and foreign policy analysts have stated that 100% Mossad has agents in the Gaza Strip. And this is also reflected in that TV show that came out in Israel in the last few years, actually very highly rated at 100% Rotten Tomatoes, by the way. This is the Fawuda TV show, 4 seasons, about the IDF versus Palestinian clash in Gaza. Frankly, a lot of Russians have actually rated the show quite well because they've stated that it kind of gives a two-way perspective. It's not exactly anti-Palestinian and it's not anti-Israeli. It kind of tries to give a very balanced take of the conflict. In any case, this particular show does display that infiltration, espionage aspect of potentially having Israeli agents infiltrate, these Palestinian resistance forces, and then, of course, trying to orchestrate and move them towards some really hasty, reckless decisions, such as that of October 7th, which at least Russia has announced that Russia still holds October 7th as a major terrorist act. This is Lavrov and Putin speaking here. But the other, of course, barbaric thing, as you mentioned, the golden pager, this is just ridiculous because the golden pager itself, the symbol of it, it's a symbol of terrorism. It's not a symbol of the fight against Hezbollah. We know that these pages in Lebanon have caused the deaths of many, many civilians. This, of course, no standard Christian country, of course, like the United States, should be what's ever sanctioned such a broad sort of terror act. But of course, Israel is not really led by Christian ethics or morality whatsoever. But again, it's a very important sign of the times, just like when Prigozhin, prior to his death in August 2023, when he gifted Boris Mironov the Kuvalda, the mace hammer of Wagner, which they used to, in those explicit videos in Syria, smash the heads of terrorists with. He gifted this massive Wagner hammer signed by himself to Boris Mironov, one of the leaders of the Russian opposition. And for this interesting photo op, it's this almost like barbaric version of, we're going to gift these symbols of 21st century postmodern terrorism and warfare to these modernistic democratic leaders. It's very bizarre. And of course, it's very far from, say, Nicholas II gifting a golden saber encrusted with diamonds to his top cavalry general during the First World War, the first saber of the empire, as it was his nickname, Count Fyodor Keller, during the First World War. So there's a really far stretch. We've gone very far from, of course, the standards of the early 20th century. And I think this sort of barbarism that has escalated in the Middle East and all across Europe and Russia, Ukraine, as we'll speak about later on today, especially some of the comments of the military priests as well, this really shows that the world really is heading into a dark place. And I think Gaza is the best example of it, and a sort of snapshot of where potentially the world will go when the Third World War will kick off in its very fiery, hot stage. And unfortunately, it's always the innocent people that will be getting hurt. And again, the conflict isn't just limited to the Gaza Strip, Palestine, the ethnic cleansing that will soon take place, I'm sure, in the West Bank, because we know that the Israeli West Bank settlers have openly supported Trump's plan for Gaza as well. They've openly spoken out in favor of it. But we know that the anti-Palestinian rhetoric also escalates to Syrians, the Lebanese people. Israel is seeking to dominate this entire greater Israel area of the Middle East, which it maps out. And there are various borders which it draws. And again, this all ties together this massive plan of preparing the kingdom of the Moshiach for the future. This is just laying out the groundwork, right? Netanyahu's only a servant of perhaps even darker powers, which eventually I think will come to power in the region. And for those, of course, claiming that this is some sort of 6D chess that Trump is running, that he wants to capture the oil and gas fields of the Leviathan fields in the Eastern Mediterranean, this is all rubbish and garbage. The Leviathan fields are there for the future kingdom of the Moshiach in Israel. I think that's 100% almost guaranteed. This is why they're not being exploited to their full capacity. It's almost like a storage of energy for the future newly rebuilt Jerusalem when the third temple will be built. And these, of course, will fund and energize this new kingdom of the Antichrist in the end times. That's at least my perspective of it. America has enough oil and gas for itself and is doing quite well, I think, economically, trying to get itself out of the recession. It's not about taking oil and gas from the Israelis. I think this is a red herring and a big distraction. And focusing on the larger Middle East issue, Conrad, I think it's quite unfortunate that the Hezbollah-Israeli peace, and of course the peace between the Lebanese and the Israeli people, has essentially been nullified recently due to the bombardment by the IDF and the Air Force. And of course, there's always this creeping feeling that perhaps the Israelis will once again push north all the way to the Litani River. These sort of warm murmurings and the gossip in the media is, I think, ever present. And now I think it's coming to fruition. I think we will see further escalation.
No, it's definitely happening. And before we talk about the latest remarks from the Ayatollah and Iran, we got to talk about Syria, Lebanon. And of course, in Syria, Israel continues to expand. Not only is Israel expanding, but the new government in Syria, they've released new maps, and some of the new maps involve Syria not having the Golan Heights, Syria not having the Alexandretta province that it has, sometimes to Turks that live there, known as the Hatay province. And so it seems that they're willing to give territory up to Turkey and to Israel. Of course, that part of the Turkish border is already totally controlled by Turkey, as is a large portion of Syria at this point. But Donald Trump has now been openly talking about potentially drawing up plans to withdraw from Syria in 60, 30, or 90 days. Now, this is from Al Jazeera. American ally SDF not yet notified of U.S. plan for Syria withdrawal. There's 2,000 SDF forces in Syria helping the YPG and these other Kurdish militias sort of defend against SNA and Turkish army that are advancing across the Euphrates River, across the dam there into their region. And again, if the U.S. leaves, then Turkey really will be able to do whatever they want. But then there's potential that Israel will get more involved to protect the Kurds there. And of course, we know in some recent videos that were released and translated into English, talks from November and December from Metropolitan Neophytos, we talked about the prophecies turning Palestine into a stadium. He talks about the prophecies about Israel striking Iran's nuclear capabilities. And he also talks about the future of a Kurdish state and the Turks damming the Euphrates, which, again, all of this is starting to look very, very likely. And again, if the Kurds are sort of thrust into the spotlight again, there could be, much like there is about Gaza, the international community could come together to try to kind of solve both of these issues in a way that gets the Islamic world and the international community involved. And as, of course, we all know, will lead to the benefit of Israel. That is why all of these things are going to be happening. Kurdish state would benefit Israel in some capacity. American Gaza, obviously, America is sort of Jewish occupied in and of itself, so that would obviously be advantageous to Israel, at least much more advantageous than Hamas or even the Palestinian Authority, or even, frankly, some other Muslim country coming in and completely ruling the area. But as, of course, the U.S. talks about leaving, the flip side of that is obvious, and that is this headline here from Jason Ditz. Turkish officials say military bases in Syria being considered. With Turkey focused on long-term goals in Syria that involve continuing to oppose Kurdish autonomy in the northeast, there are growing numbers of reports from Turkish officials that plans are being considered to establish new military bases inside Syrian territory. Details are still emerging on what this might look like, and thousands of Turkish soldiers are already reported to be operating on Syrian soil, mostly targeting the Kurdish SDF. Turkey has recently threatened invasion if the new Islamist government in Syria doesn't eliminate the SDF. The Islamist, the al-Qaeda-linked Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, has given multiple statements rejecting the idea of Kurdish autonomy. Turkish FM Hakan Fidan says the new HTS rulers of Syria are taking a firm stance against Kurdish terrorists. And of course, this week, the new president of Syria, formerly known as al-Jolani, he met with Erdogan, and Erdogan said that we came to decisions that will have, long-term lasting effects on Syrian-Turkish relations and the status quo in Syria. So I would not be surprised if Turkey fully takes the Alexandretta region, and of course, which again, it's kind of like the Golan Heights, but for Turkey as far as it being already occupied, as well as send in a lot of troops even beyond the Euphrates to, at least for the time being, try to isolate and control those Kurdish groups. Perhaps Turkey could even eventually be persuaded to support some version of an independent Kurdistan if the Kurds fully disarm and allow Turkey to basically dictate their political leadership and, kind of get rid of all these PKK, YPG, Kurdish independent, anti-Turkish aligned groups that, actually would make a lot of sense. But at the same time this is happening, this is from the Washington Post. The headline is, Syria could allow Russia to keep its bases, new defense minister said.
Mm-hmm.
And in an interview, Murhaf Abu Kasra, a one-time leader in Syria's insurgency, discussed new moves by authorities in Damascus to build new alliance. Syria is open to letting Russia keep its air and naval bases along the Mediterranean coast as long as any agreement with the Kremlin serves the country's interests, said the defense minister in an interview this week, underscoring the pragmatic approach taken by his government as it charts new alliances and reassesses old ones forged under the previous regime. Russia's attitude towards the Syrian government has improved significantly since the fall of President Bashar al-Assad in December, and Damascus is weighing Moscow's demands, signaling a dramatic shift among the former militants who make up the new Syrian government. Until recently, rebel fighters like Abu Kasra, a key leader in Syria's insurgency, were under constant bombardment by Russian warplanes. But in politics, there are no permanent enemies, he said of Moscow, once Assad's most powerful allies. So that's what's going on. Obviously, I think Russia realizes that if they can maintain any relevance there, it's going to be good for them. But at the same time, they're going to be much less safe under a much higher risk of all sorts of other things happening, much like if the U.S. is puts troops on the ground in Gaza and keeps its troops in Syria. They're always vulnerable to potential false flags. And you talked about the Israeli strikes on Hezbollah. The Syria and Lebanese border is really heating up. Of course, Israel openly striking Hezbollah in the Al-Krabeh region, which is in northeastern Lebanon, right on the border, so not even south of the Litani River. And on that eastern border, as we speak right now, huge battles basically are ongoing between Syrian military forces and multiple different pro-Hezbollah tribes. Al-Maqdad, who is a Shia cleric military leader, they claim to have killed 13 Syrian government soldiers along the Lebanese-Syrian border in the past day. And at the same time, on other major infrastructure areas in the Hawik Homs region on the Lebanese border, there's a lot of footage coming out of Syrian government forces clashing with the Zaiter clan, who are a sort of tribal family in this region that are generally pro-Hezbollah. They're Shia. So major battles ongoing there. Syria still very much trying to reclaim any sort of territorial integrity. Remember, Assad did not have control of the north, did not have full operational control of the south, and did not have much in the east. It was all just sort of central and coastal Syria, and the new government is trying to reclaim all of these areas. Of course, in Latakia, new Alawite militias are coming forward, claiming to now be arming and increasing their numbers, fighting against the Syrian regime. We're getting more and more reports of Christians, Alawites, and others that have been killed, that have been found, people that were sympathetic to Assad or perhaps worked for the regime before, even in minor capacities, are being assaulted and often killed by former HTS, who are now just the Syrian government officials in the army that are out roaming the streets with the backing of the state and the monopoly on violence. So got to keep praying for Syria. Obviously, many Orthodox Christians there. My patriarch is there. In fact, it's something in Valamond Monastery in Lebanon, right near the border as well. We're going to be talking about that later in the show. Some good news, of course, in the church. But yeah, things are very much going, unfortunately, in Israel's direction, as I've said a million times, with Israel eating up in the south, Turkey eating up in the north. Turkey also voiced its opinion that it would not accept the expulsion of the Gazans. Honestly, I'm surprised Turkey wouldn't take them themselves. They took so many Syrians, and Erdogan was even in favor of that. We talked with David Erhan about how immigration policy is sort of flipped in Turkey, with the more conservative Muslims supporting the mass migration, all the while the more secularists do not want more Islamists coming into Turkey. But we got to move to the Iran situation now, which is obviously also getting interesting. And this is from Dave DeCamp. It says, U.S. imposes new Iran sanctions targeting oil sales to China. The Trump administration on Thursday imposed new sanctions meant to target Iranian oil shipments to China, which came after the president signed an executive order to reinstate the so-called maximum pressure campaign against Iran of his previous administration. China, of course, one of Iran's biggest trading partners. And in response to this, as well as the Gaza comments from Trump, Ayatollah Khamenei, the Iranian supreme leader, he said that talks with the U.S. are not intelligent, wise, or honorable. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei suggested Tehran would not pursue negotiations with Washington. President Donald Trump recently signed an executive order that imposed additional sanctions on Tehran aimed at destroying the Iranian economy. First, negotiations with the U.S. have no effect on solving Iran's problems. The reason? Experience, Khamenei said on Friday. During the Barack Obama presidency, we sat down and negotiated with the U.S. for about 2 years, and an agreement was formed. In this agreement, the Iranian side was very generous and gave many concessions to the other side. But the U.S. did not carry out that agreement. The same person who is now in office tore up that agreement. We must learn from this experience, he continued. One must not negotiate with a government like the U.S. government. Negotiations with it is not wise, it is not intelligent, and it is not honorable. And of course, this comes amid a flurry of news stories about how Iran is supposedly ditching its initial plans and are adopting a much more crude model for a nuclear warhead so they can develop it within the next 2 weeks, some people are saying. Obviously, the Israelis are itching to get Trump to approve of their strikes on the known Iranian nuclear sites deep in the Iranian mountains, which again, we're not even sure the Israelis and the U.S. can even successfully destroy those with the full extent of their current arsenal, with how deep these facilities are in the Iranian heartland. Mm-hmm. So we know what Israel wants to do. I think Trump is trying to sort of play this out, be a strong man to do negotiations. But ultimately, we see as well with Pete Hegseth announcing since Trump's inauguration that Army recruitment numbers are way up. People are excited again. I'm sure white patriotic Americans are the ones that got fooled, at least, have been rejoining the military, as before it was mostly, frankly, just a welfare program for minorities. But now they're reaching all these new recruitment records. So it appears that World War III is back on the menu. You know, people are talking about how there's going to be more Army ads with all white guys, talking about real warfare man stuff, not a bunch of these lesbian soap operas and sob stories that they publish through the U.S. military operations these days. But the situation in Iran is obviously developing very negatively. And despite a bunch of other great things that Trump is doing, the situation in Gaza and Iran is, I think that situation is the most kinetic right now and is the most likely to dramatically escalate to something that nobody in America wants, which is a hot war in Persia. So I'd love your thoughts on that, Dimitri, before we perhaps move on to talking about U.S. aid.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Because again, this does tie into US's soft power. Well, I guess sanctions could be somewhere classed between soft power and hard power because they do actually impact the economy and the livelihood of these particular nations very severely. We know that Syria was drastically weakened, and President Assad's government in particular was weakened very intensely since the beginning of the civil war by essentially international sanctions. Syria was one of 3 most sanctions countries at a certain point besides Russia and North Korea. And of course, now Iran also joins that list. And of course, the Syrian sanctions are slowly going to be lifted, I believe, in the next few years, most likely, because again, this new government is so-called, it's democratic, and with all of its Sharia elements, somehow it fits into that great mosaic of nations which the American government can trust, these new mujahideen that have taken power. So quite bizarre. But Iran is trying to overcome these sanctions. Pezeshkian did say that Iran has a sort of big strategy of overcoming the new sanctions that, regarding the oil shipments to, as you said, China, India, and the UAE. And you have to ask, what is the link between UAE and India? Do you recall last year, Conrad, we spoke about that particular project of the Mumbai-Dubai 2,000-kilometer essentially underwater train rail system, essentially this big underwater tunnel, like the one that travels between the UK and France. It's very peculiar, but that project, I think, has been put on hold because of the situation in the Middle East ongoing at the moment. But India and the UAE and Dubai do have this really bizarre relationship, which I think is interesting. And they will most certainly, I think we know India has cut corners with Russian sanctions, so we can't really say this for sure, but I think India and the UAE will definitely comply with these US sanctions against Iran, quite unfortunately for the Persian Republic. But keeping in mind, the Supreme Leader is really not interested in sitting down with Trump. Iran, I think, will continue to develop its close relationship with Russia and continue to ignore these sanctions and the hard pressure from Donald J. Trump. I think even rhetorically speaking, Iran is very much not interested in going for any massive concessions with the United States, especially since Israel has continued to pressure its allies in Lebanon and in Hezbollah. We did see those Hezbollah Syrian clashes. The HTS government that has now taken over Syria is not just fighting against the Kurds, Conrad, in the east, but it was also putting out continuous rhetoric, which is anti-Shia, anti-Iranian. They're constantly stating that Iran was the main culprit behind the entire Syrian civil war in the first place. It's not just Bashar al-Assad. Essentially, they're calling him like a puppet of the Iranians in the first place. So this general escalation against Iran across the entire Middle East, this rhetorical statement that Lebanon has been essentially captured and held hostage by Shia Iranian-backed Hezbollah troops, which now clashing against HTS troops on the borders of Syria, and of course Hamas as well, somehow being integrated into this entire conundrum. It's causing a very tense relationship between all of these nations and various ethnicities in the Middle East. And, for those who know history, since 1923, the League of Nations granted France the mandate of Syria and Lebanon. So that entire Syrian-Lebanese border is essentially, you can almost say, artificial, which is why you do see these clashes as Alawites, Lebanese minorities, and Shia, especially members of Hezbollah who have lived in northern Syria. They're trying to get home. They're trying to reconnect with their loved ones. They're not just fighting on the border against HTS-led troops for the sake of it, for the sake of fighting or for the sake of the former Assad government. They're simply trying to, at least I think, secure the well-being of their families, which are now trapped under this bizarre semi-Turkish regime that's taken power in Damascus. And that's, I think, the main consideration, is that these artificial borders drawn between Syria and Lebanon, as all of the borders in the Middle East and many other places, even I would say the USSR and the former Commonwealth of Independent States, they are very artificial. They're essentially just maps drawn, these lines drawn on a map, and they have divided peoples, tribes, various ethnicities, similar to when we speak about Africa. I think it's a very similar situation there. And of course, these artificial lines drawn on the map, without any real historical distinction, they do always cause for further tensions and agitations amongst these various groups. And I think, the powers that be, the globalists, the Talmudic cabal, they utilize this, of course, in their favor as they strike and they promote a civil war between these various countries and people to weaken these big, massive sovereign state actors that could at one stage fight Israel, but now are essentially weakened they've essentially sent them back to the early 20th century in terms of technology and what kind of power they do have. So that's interesting. But just brief comment, because we don't have many news regarding Armenia, Azerbaijan, but just north of Iran, and in relation to sanctions, President of Azerbaijan, Ilham Aliyev, has accused Pashinyan and the Armenian government of actually not sanctioning Russia and not sticking to the Russian sanctions and trading with Russia. How bizarre is this, Conrad? Because on one hand, Baku and Moscow, they have this really tight relationship where they, of course, continue to negotiate, continue to speak about oil, gas, the trade in the Caspian, even these talks about a normalization of relations between Azerbaijan and Iran because of Russia's presence there and Russia's relationship, both of the nations. On the other hand, they're accusing Armenia, their neighbor, of breaching sanctions against Russia and not sticking to these Western sanctions, which is absolutely insane. I mean, rhetorically speaking, this is just very hypocritical, two-faced, but we've always warned against this Azeri Talmudic strategy. We know the Azerbaijanis are very much, their elites are very much integrated with the Mountain Jew communities, and I think it will continue to show its face. Like the big nose will continue to appear behind the scenes as the curtain is lifted.
Yeah, they're going after Russia for the whole plane crash situation, talking up everybody about that. I can't stand Azerbaijan, man. It's one of my least favorite countries. Israel, Azerbaijan, get them out of here, in my opinion. But you're talking a lot about some of these smaller countries in Central Asia, a lot of the U.S. Zog influence, and the U.S. aid story is really shedding an amazing amount of light onto the covert operations, the U.S. tentacle deep state, how it influences all sorts of horrible things going on around the world. And of course, everybody's going through these databases. USAID, of course, hasn't been ended. Everyone's talking about how it was ended. It's being moved. It's been frozen for 90 days and is getting reintegrated under the State Department under Marco Rubio, the new Secretary of State. And they're claiming that all 1,200 or I can't remember how many staff members there were, thousands and thousands of USAID staff. That staff will now be reduced to like 24 people or something like that. So really, really good stuff. And some of the biggest things that were being funded by USAID that's now come to light, that being the OCCRP, the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, which is openly an anti-Russia operation funded by George Soros. They got over $5 million from USAID. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, they get over 129 million plus annually from USAID and the National Endowment for Democracy. Specifically in 2019, USAID gave Radio Free Europe $6 million specifically to counter Russian disinformation in Central Asia. Bellingcat received millions and millions of dollars. We know that they're a disinformation outlet. $250,000 in 2023 alone from Meduza, one of the biggest anti-Russian outlets, the Kiev Independent, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars from USAID, and I could go on. And then some of the more egregious things as well. We remember $2.5+ million to increase DEI in Serbia's workplace, $500,000+ to spread atheism in Nepal. We, of course, had 20+ million or something towards the group that funds all the NAFO idiots that you see on the internet. We saw tens of millions of dollars towards transgender procedures in South Africa, all sorts of other gender homosexuality nonsense. So we're glad to see that all of this is going away. I did a segment. It's not going to be out probably by the time you're listening to this. We'll share it on all of our social medias when we do. But I did do a segment on Spas TV with Andrei Afanasiev talking all about USAID as well as some Israel-Gaza stuff. So be sure to check that out when it comes out. It'll all be linked below. But as far as other things going on, obviously Trump's doing great stuff with this USAID stuff. He's also doing really good stuff with the other sort of house that he's cleaning with Doge and Elon Musk and all these guys that are auditing all of this federal government stuff. They claim that he's going to unleash Doge on the Pentagon and have them start auditing military spending, which, if that starts happening, people might start dying very quickly. But I'm here for it. I think we love to see it. But some of the other executive orders, unfortunately, not quite as good. Of course, we know that Trump made the recommendation to the Department of Education and signed these executive orders against anti-Semitism, basically solidifying the IHR, the International Holocaust Remembrance Group's definition of anti-Semitism into some form of U.S. law. They're already talking about deporting. They've already removed visas, of course, from Palestinian protest organizers, foreign students that were here on visa. And again, this is all just setting the stage for domestic anti-Semitism laws. I believe it's 26+ states have extremely draconian BDS and anti-Semitism laws. Of course, in Florida, if you walk around putting out flyers and some of them falls on other people's property and it can be considered anti-Semitic, you can go to jail. Of course, in all of these states, anti-BDS laws, which are, BDS means boycott, divest, and sanction, which was an anti-Israel sort of international business boycott, which if you're in any of these states, you're completely excluded from any kind of federal aid or grants if you participate in BDS. So, very much not constitutional. This is the closest thing America has to full-on hate speech laws. And unfortunately, it seems the Trump administration is very much for it. And you're going to get bipartisan support for this in both legislatures because both sides are run by Jews. So it's unfortunate to see. It's unfortunate to also see the deportation numbers continue to go down. They aren't even being reported every day. Certain days have less than 350 deportations, which again, if something like that keeps up, that's gearing up for like somewhere between 100 and 200,000 deportations in all of Trump's second term. And I'm going to be honest, I'm not convinced that many people aren't still secretly getting over the border illegally to begin with, because it's still a great reduction. We know that 10 million plus came in under Biden. But if we're only going to deport 100,000 people in 4 years, that's not even worth it at all. Why go through the rigmarole at that point? It's just going to serve to propagandize the left, get a bunch of pictures of crying kids, and then they're going to come back with a vengeance and open the borders super hard next time. You have to be going hard. We have to be you got to be deporting at least 10 million people in this term, and there's just no way that they're ever going to reach those numbers. Up to 6,000 a day, it does not seem like they have the political will. But speaking of people that do have political will, it's more Israelis. And I'm sure everybody's heard about the Luka Doncic trade from the Dallas Mavericks. And I know this isn't a sports show. I'm really not into the NBA. I think it's, bread and circuses and whatnot. But, I enjoy my college football and whatnot, so I can respect those that enjoy sport. But everybody's shocked at what's being called the worst trade in NBA history. Luka Doncic, the Slovenian Serb superstar of the Dallas Mavericks, has been traded to the Los Angeles Lakers to play with big LeBron James. He got traded for Anthony Davis, a first-round pick, and I think some other player. I don't know all these NBA details. But the real story on this is what people are going to find interesting, and that is that this entire time, of course, Mark Cuban, the former owner of the Mavericks, a year and a half ago, of course, real name Mark Chebanitsky, he sold the basketball team to Miriam Adelson, Sheldon Adelson's widow, who we know bankrolled the Trump campaign to the tune of $100 million to secure West Bank annexation. And now what's happening, of course, is for the past year and a half, the Adelsons have been attempting to lobby the Texas legislature and Greg Abbott to approve and legalize casino gambling in Texas. I believe Adelson was one of Greg Abbott's largest donors. They've hired over 100 lobbyists to swarm my hometown here of Austin to lobby every single representative in the legislature to support this casino gambling thing. And they're basically threatening the city of Dallas, the state of Texas, claiming that if they don't get that, so they can build this sort of big stadium casino resort place attached to the Dallas Mavericks brand, they're going to take the team to Las Vegas, which of course, that's where the Adelsons are from. That's where they made all their money in casinos. And part of that threat has been, it doesn't seem like the legislature is going to budge per se. So they flexed their muscles and just screwed the team. They just gave away the best player. They ruined everything for the fan base. They've pissed everybody off to now even people that are fans people are saying that they're okay with the Mavs moving to Las Vegas. They're saying it's over, Luka's gone, all this kind of stuff. So this is just another example of Jewish capital completely having full spectrum dominance and flexing its muscles to enrich the people at the top, which in this case is some of the richest ultra-Zionists that exist, they're buying off their state, they're buying off their country, they're representing their true nation, Israel, in a very, I guess you could say, aggressive way. And look, again, I'm not super into the NBA. There's 2 other NBA teams in Texas, but it's just unacceptable for some Jewish oligarch to come in to the state of Texas and bully everybody around and try to take away a professional basketball team that millions and millions of people enjoy watching just so they can legalize gambling, which is wrong. There should not be casino gambling in Texas. Gambling is a sin. So this idea that we would introduce this horrible vice to this massive state that has all sorts of poor people that do not need to be taken advantage of by predatory casinos, the Jews, they don't like to hear that. So little interesting story there for anybody that was following that. But unless you have anything else on the domestic front, Dimitri, we probably need to move on to talk about Russia, Ukraine.
Well, yeah, I think the US aid story ties into Ukraine very smoothly because, again, we've acknowledged since we began the show in October, November 2022 that Russia has essentially lost the info war almost from the beginning of the SMO and even prior to that. I think since 2014, since even the Donetsk-Lugansk debacle and the referendum in Crimea, Russia has just been, its soft power has been weakened to such an extent, and it really hasn't even invested in the Ukrainian soft power aspect, which is one of the reasons why even people in Kherson and Zaporozhye haven't really sided with Russia in the large masses that perhaps they should have, and including, of course, Kharkovsky Oblast and Sumsky Oblast, all these oblasts which have literally ethnic Russians living in them. And I think there's little to no Ukrainianism there in terms of even the artificial ideology which was created in the 20th century. But just consider US aid, Conrad, the annual budget estimated to be at around 50 billion American dollars. That's, if the estimates for the Russian military budget now that we're almost in the 3rd year of the SMO, is roughly, we're looking at close to 100 billion American dollars in 1 year. So the annual budget of the US aid is half of that of the military budget of the entire Russian Federation. That is insane. So all this aid, and of course, for those of you, of course, thinking that, well, perhaps from a humanitarian Christian perspective, it's going to the poor, starving kids in Africa, in the Middle East, Southeast Asia, etc. It's not. A lot of this money is simply going to degenerate Joseph Mengele type projects. But unlike Joseph Mengele, which we're not even sure if all these various stories created after the Second World War are even true regarding him, it's more like the Pavel Sudoplatov type of thing, where he was experimenting on behalf of the Soviet states on German and Soviet Gulag prisoners, testing poisons. We have here literally different LGBTQ type apparatuses and social conditioning being tested on various people around the world in Africa, the Middle East. I mean, there was even money literally donated for, condoms for Gaza, things like this. Absolutely insane. But the most egregious would probably be even Maria Zakharova has accused the US of breaching, say, animal rights because $10 million was allocated towards transgender organ transplants between male and female rats. Right, so transgender operations. This is very satanic, and frankly, it's unfortunate that U.S. taxpayer dollars, or perhaps even U.S. printed fake fiat money, which inflates and, of course, devalues the regular salaries and wages of the average American citizen, is being used for these particular purposes. And we've all spoken about George Soros, Open Society, these private NGOs which fund liberalism and postmodernism around the world and essentially push the world into this sinful state in which the Moshiach will, of course, come to power and sort of enlighten. It's not just George Soros and these private NGOs. It was a publicly funded operation. And I think this is what this horror of US aid uncovers. It's very anti-Christian. It's first and foremost anti-Orthodox because, again, it goes against all of our values, despite what all these various Protestant denominations, of course, are supporting, unfortunately, around the world. I mean, some of them would probably agree that DEI is a good thing, but this is the general state of, I think, Western Christianity is going down this particular very dark rabbit hole. And of course, this ties to Ukraine because US aid was supporting over 6,200 journalists around the world, 707 media outlets worldwide. Absolutely insane. Imagine 707 businesses which promote media of various sorts. 9 out of 10 of the media outlets in Ukraine were supported by US aid. And 279 media NGOs around the world were, of course, funded by US aid. Insane, which you're right, the NAFO crowd, all the various degenerates who, of course, were pushing anti-Russian, anti-Christian propaganda around Ukraine were all funded by the US aid program. It's essentially anti-Christian and promoting, of course, this anti-Christian, anti-Orthodox Ukrainian rhetoric, which pushed the entire state of Ukraine and the Verkhovna Rada to pass these anti-Ukrainian Orthodox laws in the last few years, and all the persecution. This is all funded by US aid's soft power to essentially weaken, demoralize people and to have them brainwashed that perhaps the Russian Orthodox Church is somehow promoting the bloodshed that you see in the SMO, which it really is not. So it's quite important that this ties directly to the Ukrainian conflict. But generally speaking, like the frontline update, I think is very telling. Essentially, the entire SMO process, despite the fact that Putin and Trump haven't sat down in the same room and really discussed any sort of peace treaty, it is visibly slowing down. So we did have the official announcement, Conrad, finally it's been done. The Russian Ministry of Defense has announced that Toretsk has fallen to the Russian forces. It's now Russian officially. Chasiv Yar, fighting is still going on there. Now, what's important about Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, we've been talking about these two cities for literally months now. Of course, the fighting has been egregiously slow, right? And the Russians have been taking their time, of course, probably saving the lives of their own troops, sort of really taking the fighting very methodically. But Toretsk and Chasiv Yar, to the north of Donetsk, they lead to the major two big cities. And one of them is, of course, Kramatorsk, and it's right next to Slavyansk. We all remember Slavyansk from 2014, how Strelkov, Motorola, etc., and of course Alexei Mozgovoi, they held these particular two cities against the Ukrainians when the Maidan coup occurred, and Slavyansk was one of these first fortress cities that the Orthodox Christians have held against the Ukrainian NATO-supported junta, which took power in Kiev. So it's a really symbolic city, and Chasiv Yar and Toretsk lead to the taking of the city. Now, further to the southeast, essentially, if you look at a map where Zaporozhye meets the Donetsk Oblast, you do see the major city of Pokrovsk, which we've been discussing. There's been some heavy fighting there everywhere, essentially one of the hottest zones of the SMO right now. The Russians are pushing towards Pokrovsk. It's not surrounded by any stretch of the imagination, but the Russians are carefully trying to surround this particular area. It's a very key city. Again, these two oblasts essentially meet, and it's one of these major sort of city points, which I think Ukrainians will defend essentially until the last Ukrainian, so to speak, and they're not really looking to lose any more ground there. But the pace has been slowed. I think officially Oleg Tsaryov has announced that the general fighting has decreased since the victory of Donald J. Trump from December 2024 until February now. The average skirmishes, assaults, and clashes between Russia and Ukraine has decreased from 200 in December to 100 now in February. So almost by half, essentially, it's been cut. And this has really shown, I think, that Russia is perhaps willing to maybe sit down, negotiate, at least with Donald J. Trump, but not Zelensky. There's officially already statements from all kinds of Russian diplomats, of course, notwithstanding, of course, Sergei Lavrov himself, that Zelensky has no legitimacy because of the election, of course, in May, which would have happened last year. We know, of course, that this weird double standard hypocrisy that, well, it's only a democratic election, which apparently will give a leader legitimacy. I think it's kind of a double-edged sword here, Conrad, to kind of rely on the liberal democratic model to proclaim legitimacy. But we understand that for normies, for people who just watch mainstream Russian, Ukrainian, American news, this is probably a big sticking point, and the Russians will stay with it, similar to the neo-Nazi rhetoric. It's like, well, if a leader isn't democratically elected, therefore he is illegitimate. Again, we Orthodox Christians need to take this with a big grain of salt, and I think all conservative Christians, including Catholic, monarchists, etc. We know that democracy is not the be-all, end-all of legitimacy, and that's not to state that Zelensky is in any way legitimate. I think we all know exactly which particular people he's from and who he supports, and in Ukraine in particular, he's definitely this parasitical entity which represents a much larger, more predatory clan, which is seeking the death of probably all Ukrainians, in particular the Christians of the land. Now, the major fighting in Kursk, this crazy stuff has taken place this week. So, as we know, Sudzha, the Russians have been trying to push towards Sudzha, capturing villages leading up to it, and the Ukrainians have at last ushered in a counteroffensive, which has dramatically failed. This is probably the largest failed assault since the assault of the 5th, the 6th, and 7th of January, so just before Russian Orthodox Christmas, so just a month ago. The Ukrainians, in the last week, Conrad, they lost, in one particular day, 40 armored vehicle carriers, tanks, and all kinds of other vehicles by trying to push out to the southeast of Suja, so trying to push the Russians back in this really dramatic counteroffensive style. Probably thousands of Ukrainian infantry took part in it, and there were many, many losses. In fact, all these vehicles, they were using gravel roads and some of the other concreted roads, and they made themselves open targets for the Russian artillery and air force, which was quite bizarre. So the Ukrainians really are not learning from the military failures of the past, and losing 40 vehicles in one day is quite insane. And this, of course, from the village of Makhnovka to Ulanovo. So it's this entire several kilometer stretch of land the Ukrainians tried to push out again, pushing the Russians back in Kursk, but they failed. So again, this big battle for Sudzha continues in the Kursk oblasts. And, as we'll discuss later on in the church news, there's a lot of stories of atrocities that the Ukrainians have committed. But by Ukrainians, I mean these various mercenaries, these are not exactly the innocent draftees who've literally been kidnapped and human trafficked to fight as human cannon fodder on the front lines, but some of these really Banderite types who have committed crimes in the past. Before we recall, during the Russian Civil War, even the village of Makhnovka, it's named after General Nestor Makhno, the anarchist who allied with the Bolsheviks and fought against the Cossacks and Wrangel, Denikin during the Russian Civil War. There's this banditry type element to Western and maybe Central Ukrainianism, which again shows its face every few years. It showed its face again during the Second World War when the Banderites committed all kinds of atrocities against the local peoples, even without even the sanctioning of Third Reich German leadership. They just wanted to kill Russians and kill those who assumed themselves to be Russians on this land. So this again, it's this particular demon is showing its face in the Kursk Oblast. Who knows what the Russians will uncover when the entirety of Kursk is finally liberated. It's quite intense. And generally speaking, Zaporozhye, Kherson, very stable, sort of just long-range artillery fighting, both sides sending drones at one another. It very much has slowed down. And the question is, Conrad, why exactly? Is this because there's a premediation of some sort of, is it because there's a premeditation of a certain peace or a conferencing that will take place, or is either side just trying to really catch its breath before perhaps a further assault? And the Russian government has announced that it will be progressing the war for another 9 months at least. And we recall back when the defense minister was still Sergei Shoigu, he did state that the Russian government is willing to fight for another few years at least. Again, at the end of this year, Conrad, we recall the duration of the Second World War was only 3 years and 10 months for Russia, from June of 1941 to May of 1945. At the end of 2025 this year, the SMO Russo-Ukrainian war of recent years will be longer than the Russian participation in the Second World War, which in terms of length and duration, that is absolutely insane. So on one hand, the war is more humanitarian in nature in terms of there aren't millions of deaths on the Russian side. On the other hand, it begs the question as to what exactly are the objectives, because none of the objectives that was set out initially on the 24th of February 2022 have been met. Ukraine is not denazified, it's not demilitarized, and certainly there's still pressure against native Russians. There's still an ongoing sort of ethnic cultural genocide behind the scenes. So again, what exactly are we talking about here? And Kherson, Zaporozhye are still occupied, even Donetsk, what can we say? The fighting continues, the bloodshed, and we can only say that I think still real peace can only be achieved through a stalwart, strong, and Christian in nature Russian victory. And that, I think, continues to be the main sort of theme. And we continue to sort of speak about these objectives which Russia must meet in terms of its real purpose as a rising new Christian leader in the world.
No, I couldn't agree more. And speaking of the territorial gains that have yet to be realized, as far as I'm aware, Svyatogorsk Monastery, our beloved Ether Hour pixel art for you YouTube watchers, is still completely in the gray zone, still completely on the front line. I don't know the exact troop positions across the river there. We'll perhaps look into it, but this isn't the best. And be sure to, speaking of Ether Hour, be sure to check out our latest Ether Hour episode this week with military analyst, geopolitical genius George McMillan III. He gives some very good insight, and much like Victor Bout and others we've talked about, he too predicts that Russia will ultimately be obligated to take the entire Black Sea coast all the way to Odessa, which at this point we definitely hope for. I still think it's very much on the table, but these next few weeks are going to be critical because it does appear that Trump, he's done a lot in the Middle East. He's done a lot on the border. He's done a lot in his sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere with the New Monroe Doctrine. He's spooked the Danes about Greenland. He's, put tariffs on Canada and China. And, this trade war still ongoing. It's obviously a political tool. I don't think the tariffs are going to be permanent, but Trump is talking about more retaliatory tariffs on China. Mexico, these other places. Of course, Mexico folded immediately to the tariffs and got them rescinded by sending troops to its northern border. But be sure to check out that Ether Hour with George McMillan. We talk about all sorts of things. Be sure to like this video as well. I know I forgot to say it at the beginning of this episode, but you listeners, please, please, please like the episodes. You've been doing a great job recently. Our episodes have gotten more likes than ever, so we greatly appreciate it, and we appreciate all of your shares, especially you paid subscribers. You guys keeping the show going, so thank you for that. But Dimitri, I want your thoughts on these other things in Ukraine, specifically these new Mirage 2000 fighter jets that have just arrived from France. These are, I think, brought to be more numerous than the F-16s that the United States, of course, already gave Ukraine. And we know that Ukraine keeps those pretty far to the west. They use those to shoot down missiles, perhaps over Lvov and other places, because as far as I'm aware, I've yet to see any news of Russians shooting one of these Western jets down. And I think the West, the people that send them these planes, are very consciously directing where these go, where the Ukrainians are allowed to fly them, and in hopes, of course, that they are not shot down and captured by the Russians, which would, of course, at a basic level would be a big propaganda victory for Russia. And if one of them is shot down over Russian territory and captured, that would be a big intelligence, military technology loss for these Western powers as well. So I'm wondering your thoughts on that, as well as, like you said, these negotiations seem to be in a sort of holding pattern where everybody, kind of a lot of the people, obviously all the soldiers on the ground want it to happen. Trump claims to want it to happen. But as we talked about with George in our episode that, again, everybody should really go listen to, it seems that Putin and Lavrov, with the understanding of AfD and these other countries likely to come to power in some capacity in Central and Western Europe, that will eventually perhaps reignite some of these pipelines. Perhaps Nord Stream 1 could be repaired. Some of these other things, the gas through Ukraine could be restarted again, of course, if enough pressure is put on Ukraine from these European countries. So I think there's a chance that Putin doesn't see immediate negotiations as in his favor. The only conclusion from that, though, is why isn't he making a bigger move on the ground to increase his leverage in potential negotiations, or to just do what has to be done? Because I agree that Trump probably isn't going to reignite some big offensive. But again, as we discussed with the whole Gaza thing, Trump is very unpredictable.
No, absolutely. There are some inside reports from the Krasnoyarsk Oblast, for example. Like, Russia does have 8 major prisons there. These are like former, essentially, gulag structures. This is far deep Siberia. And allegedly, from what I've heard from people on the ground, is that 5 out of 8 of those prisons are essentially empty. And these are mostly male prisons. So essentially, Russia is still giving prisoners an opportunity, just like Wagner did at some time, to reduce their, essentially, grant clemency to them if they serve on the front lines. So there's still an ongoing sort of call for mobilization from the real Russian patriots in order to finally fulfill this Ukrainian-Russian conflict in a Russian victory, cement the victory. But the Russian state, I think, is very hesitant because, again, this weird obsession with legitimacy through ratings, legitimacy through democracy, and of course a new call for a new wave of mobilization of 300 or 500,000 troops would again cause all kinds of bad feelings amongst the general Russian population, especially the lukewarm parts of it who simply don't want to hear about the conflict, don't want to get engaged at all, and the young people. So young men, probably Zoomers between the ages of like 18 and 30, many of them, of course, are not interested in the conflict whatsoever. They want to be Europeans. They've been fed all kinds of garbage, and essentially they've also been fed US aid slop, which only frankly ended in Russia since 2013. So keep in mind, prior to 2013, even under Putin's presidency, US aid was very active, even in Russia, funding the NGOs. So the brainwashing of the youth has in fact continued. But you're completely correct. These Mirage F-16 planes as well have arrived from the Netherlands. The thing we don't know is that we don't have the official numbers. No media outlets have been given any clear indication of how many Mirage planes from France or F-16s from the Netherlands have arrived at Ukraine. We only know that they're being kept for something, right? For some special, probably counteroffensive by Ukraine. We did see some footage of them flying around, but in fact, it's most likely in those airports and training facilities in Romania or maybe far western Ukraine, far away from those long-range Russian strikes. And at the moment, it's just a lot more economic from the Ukrainian perspective of using drones. And Ukraine still remains dominant in its drone production as well as drone use. In fact, they've been actually developing and progressing their drone technologies, even in the most, shall we say, primitive fashions. Like one of the examples from the front lines in the Kursk Oblast, what they've been doing is, as you know, the Russians have been using pump action or automatic shotguns against the drones in order to take out their propellers. So what the Ukrainians have started doing is they would get a lightweight sheet of metal and attach it to the bottom of the drone to protect its sort of a vital organ, so that it can fly and get very close to these blindage and all kinds of Russian trenches and actually drop or shoot its bombs, or even the suicide drones, so they can fly in effectively and infiltrate Russian positions and hurt as many Russians as possible. So the Ukrainians have been developing even their drone technologies, and they're quite happy to continue using them. The question is, when will these Mirages and F-16s actually be used by the Ukrainians, even in the east, right? Because we know that the Ukrainians are losing massive territories. As soon as Pokrovsk is properly besieged by Russia, there'll be all kinds of calls from the military generals, I believe, just to the east of the Dnieper. We know that I've heard that the Ukrainians have over 1 million servicemen active just to the east of the Dnieper River, which begs the question as to why Russia continues to delay on the bombing of the Dnieper bridges leading across, and of course attaching this massive Ukrainian army and all these defensive positions to the main Ukrainian land in the west. All kinds of questions as to what the hesitation is behind, and possibly it is, Conrad, because there are those in the Russian government who they do want to reintegrate with the West. They do want to perhaps walk back some of these key sanctions, especially on these oligarchs and the people who, I guess, intermarried into the Russian bureaucratic elites. And it's a push and pull type of situation. Not all the Russian elites and politicians are as patriotic as, say, potentially Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin or even Dmitry Medvedev, who posts very verbose and powerful rhetorical hawkish statements on Telegram. And that's, I think, the unfortunate reality of the matter here is that Russia is still not 100% devoted to the victory as much as it should be. And I think this is probably why we've seen certain failures or perhaps even significant delays in the conduct of the war. And going forward, as you said, I agree, Putin has all the leverage at the moment. He's probably going to gain even more so as the war progresses and as Ukraine continues to fail, as it has in Kursk and Sudzha just this week, 40 vehicles destroyed in one day. And very possibly that the US and Ukraine will need to give massive concessions, as much as throughout the entire eastern Dnieper River give all of that to Russia potentially through a future peace negotiation. This would be, I think, a victory. Alongside, of course, and we have to advocate for this very openly, an end to the persecution of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine. I think this has to be literally on the agenda. When we speak about church news, I think we'll say that this is a ever-present concern for the actual parishioners of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church all across Ukraine, from the central regions, which are persecuted endlessly, to the western regions where it's literally, where they get assaulted, hurt, and even killed on almost a weekly basis. And the persecution there is a lot more harsh because the further west you go, the more Roman Catholic the general population, the more Western it is in mindset, and the more anti-Russian propaganda there is. And again, anti-Russian propaganda is always coupled with anti-Orthodox Christian propaganda, unfortunately, which this is just the reality of the modern Ukrainian abomination state.
Unfortunately, that's true. We're going to have some church persecution updates at the end, as well as some good church news as well. So don't despair. But before we move on to some Africa stuff, I've got to talk about the rest of the European continent and developments there, which of course are very closely linked with Russia-Ukraine. This is from Wallachian Gazette. On February 3rd, for the first time in history, Romania began exporting natural gas to Transnistria. Data from the national company Transgaz showed 1.9 million cubic meters of natural gas were flowing out of Romania at the metering station in Asakea towards Ukraine. Ukraine is not the final destination of the natural gas, the final destination being Tiraspol, per the agreement negotiated by the Moldovan and Transnistrian delegates with the backing of the EU. So we know that Russia is also sending flights full of humanitarian oil, as it were, to Transnistria as the rolling blackouts continue. But obviously, this play by Romania, I'm sure, has been gamed out to be an eventual path towards just taking over Pridnestrovia entirely, separating them from the Russian sphere of influence, and perhaps ultimately getting Romania closer to unification with Moldova, which that is, of course, a long-term goal of all sorts of Romanians. Remember last week we talked about Calin Georgescu wanting to get Romania, get parts of Serbia, Hungary, Slovakia, and of course Ukraine, which would look like, I'm a Romania respecter, but we got to remember Romania, they're already pretty big. Like, they benefited a lot after the world wars. Meanwhile, you've got Hungary, Serbia next door, who have been completely, raped of their land. I don't know how much they're going to appreciate Georgescu talking about taking more of it, but I rest my case. This oil news is very big. Of course, this could also ultimately be a catalyst for Russia to intervene more in Transnistria, because if they see Romania really moving in there and Moldova, the Maya Sandu government also starting to make bigger moves, Russia might not accept that. And hopefully, and from my perspective at least, that could also escalate the moves towards Odessa, because Transnistria obviously is right next to the Odessa Oblast. But in other related continental oil and gas news, this is really big stuff. The German government and the industry consider the return of the Nord Stream pipeline. This is from Clean Energy Wire. It says the German government and industry players are considering using parts of the contentious Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline connecting Russia and Germany through the Baltic Sea for hydrogen deliveries from Finland in the future. And of course, if this thing is put back to, operational levels, there's no reason to say that eventually Russia and Germany couldn't start, trading in the energy sphere again. And of course, this is in conjunction with this other big news on that front, which states that, this is from MSN, this week Denmark's energy agency granted permission for Nord Stream 2 AG, the Russian-owned operator of the pipeline infrastructure, to begin sealing off the severed ends of the 3 damaged pipelines. This move could mark the first step towards restoring a crucial energy link that, before Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, supplied up to 40% of Germany's gas, according to an analysis by The Spectator. The decision comes just days after Alice Weidel, leader of Germany's Alternative for Deutschland party, declared that the population could count on her to bring the Nord Stream back to full functionality. Weidel also vowed to dismantle Germany's wind turbines and restart the country's nuclear power plants. However, the idea of resuming business with Russia after a ceasefire in Ukraine, as if nothing had happened, has alarmed several EU nations, particularly those wary of Germany's strategic dependence on Putin's gas. So this is big stuff, like we said in the show with George McMillan. If the AfD can enter into some form of government in any capacity after the February 23rd elections, then Putin's negotiating standing is going to be very increased. So if anything, February 23rd might be one of the most important dates that we might have to get past before we see perhaps a big Russian move along the front line, which that wouldn't surprise me at all. But unless you have anything to say quickly about that gas stuff, I'll move on to Africa, Dimitri.
No, absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head here, and it's definitely the Romanian move of allowing gas, especially during this tail end of winter, to enter into transitory is like a good faith sort of move in order to reintegrate, of course, these former Romanian, or at least ethnically Romanian territories into the greater Romanian sphere, especially if Russia shows any sort of weakness. It won't be able to present itself in the Odessa Oblast into the future, and Romania can then potentially, as Ukraine disintegrates, take more real territory with actual Romanians living in it, or those related to Romania by blood, by culture and heritage. Of course, we Russians have a different sort of view of who Bessarabia and Pridnestrovia and Moldova should belong to, looking back in history at the 1700s, 1800s, as to who liberated these lands from the Turks through all of our difficult efforts, sweat and blood, all these military operations against the Ottoman Empire. But we understand, of course, that Romania first politicians like Georgescu will, of course, continue to push that particular agenda moving forward. It's just a difference of approach, I think. And there are differing interests even amongst Orthodox Christian countries. But the hope is that Romania, again, liberates itself from this NATO-EU influence, which is hopefully what the election later this year will show.
Yeah, again, Georgescu in Romania, we really hope that he wins, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Romania's role as a NATOist state and its expanding influence won't continue under his watch. If anything, it could be kind of like Trump, one of these sort of Trojan horse things to get nationalist and right-wing people on board with what is effectively Club of Rome level regionalization of the world. Because, Georgescu talking about reclaiming all this territory, Trump talking about Greenland, Canada, all this kind of stuff. Again, we don't want to sleepwalk into the Hunger Games world with, Jewish control ruling over all of us. But we have to talk about Africa because so many things are going on there. Africa is in the midst of fully entering the Third World War. Of course, we've talked about the Sahel Wars. We've talked about Sudan, which we have more to talk about today. But this war between the DRC and Rwanda, which is engulfing all of these other states, is expanding. In many ways, this is the literal African Third World War because it's a follow-up to what are colloquially referred to as the First and Second African World Wars, more locally referred to as, the Second Congo War, for example, in the early 2000s, which some estimate had up to tens of millions of displaced people and those killed and affected by the conflict. So this region is not, this region knows war, but it appears that in this more multipolar world, it's like the war is kind of advancing a little bit. And of course, we saw an interview recently from Paul Kagame, the president of Rwanda, who his forces are the ones making the most headway, the M23 militia into Eastern Congo, into these sorts of places. And he talked about his country getting deprived of U.S. aid, but he said that he agrees with Trump on many things, and perhaps his country will learn some things from their short-term suffering being cut off from the U.S. aid. But one of the countries that's getting drawn into this as well is Malawi. And this is a headline from the BBC. The Malawi president orders troops to withdraw from the Democratic Republic of Congo. That's Lazarus Chakwera. And again, Malawi had a peacekeeping force there because Congo is not a peaceful country even before this Rwandan invasion happened. But ultimately, all these groups, like we mentioned last week, the Romanian mercenaries that were forced to lay down their arms, who were fighting with the DRC forces, but this is Malawi withdrawing its troops. Other forces getting drawn in. This is from Rerum Novarum. Burundi sends an additional 2,000 soldiers to the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo to help fight M23, bringing its total to 12,000. So we have Burundi, 12,000 troops there. South Africa talking about potentially sending troops. Rwanda, of course, despite being this tiny little country, is one of the biggest military, quote unquote, superpowers in the region, and they are taking fairly large amounts of territory. And again, there are Orthodox parishes here that are coming under fire. The M23 rebels do claim, and I haven't seen a whole lot of evidence of much terrorism, they claim to be keeping the streets safe, which again, when it comes to African countries, sometimes militias coming in is just an objective benefit for the people there because of how lawless some of these places are. However, these people are coming under fire. We got to pray for these Alexandrian Patriarchate, as well as perhaps some of these are under the new African exarchate of the Moscow Patriarchate as well. We got to pray for all of these priests and deacons. There's a report on Ortho Christian about this. You can check out more about that. But obviously, Africa is erupting all over the place. And all the while this is going on, the Syrian armed forces are rapidly advancing against the RSF, who, again, is the UAE-backed militia that has been attempting to take Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, for years now. But the SAF, the armed forces, have pushed them back, pushed them away out of Khartoum. They're pushed them even 180 miles outside of the city. They're recapturing these suburban areas. The leaders and military heads of the SAF are able to re-enter their military offices on the outskirts of Khartoum, which they haven't for over 2 years now. And again, I think a lot of this has to do with Russia and some of these other superpowers still maintaining support for the SAF, and some forces had even switched from supporting the RSF to supporting the government forces. And again, I think this all hinges on their promise to give Russia a port on the Red Sea, which again, Ethiopia, its fight for access to the Red Sea is very tied into this conflict as well, but it isn't as hot right now. But again, I have no real loyalty in the Sudanese conflict, but whichever side is going to give Russia the port, I guess, maybe they deserve to win. And it's probably for the best that it's the already established government, not the UAE-backed strongman, which if the UAE people got in power, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw Sudan fully integrated into the IMEC corridor, which, again, like we talked about with George McMillan, that would be a serious blow to the multipolar world and their emerging, energy connectivity. But the final thing in Africa that I want to talk about is this executive order for President Donald Trump, which comes in the aftermath of Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC's new bill that allows for the expropriation of land without compensation, specifically, of course, as we know, from white Afrikaner farmers. And this executive order is pretty amazing, if I'm going to be honest here. This is from whitehouse.gov, Presidential Actions Addressing Egregious Actions of the Republic of South Africa, Executive Order, published February 7th, 2025. By the authority vested in me as President by the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America, it is hereby ordered as follows. And then it goes on to explain the purpose of this. It says, in shocking disregard of its citizens' rights, the Republic of South Africa recently enacted the Expropriation Act 13 of 2024 to enable the government of South Africa to seize ethnic minority Afrikaners' agricultural property without compensation. The act follows countless government policies designed to dismantle equal opportunity in employment, education, and business, and hateful rhetoric and government actions fueling disproportionate violence against racially disfavored landowners. In addition, South Africa has taken aggressive positions towards the United States and its allies, including accusing Israel, not Hamas, of genocide in the International Court of Justice, which this starts to get pretty cringe. I don't know why we need to be talking about Israel here. Unfortunately, the Afrikaners are loosely allied with Israel because, of course, the ANC and the Nelson Mandela communist government have, of course, allied against Israel and the ICC and these other places. But the United States cannot support the government of South Africa's commission of rights violations in its country or its undermining of United States foreign policy, which poses national security threats to our nations, our allies, our African partners, and our interests. It is the policy of the United States that as long as South Africa continues these unjust and immoral practices that harm our nation, A, the United States shall not provide aid or assistance to South Africa, and B, the United States shall promote the resettlement of Afrikaner refugees escaping government-sponsored race-based discrimination, including racially discriminatory property confiscation. So this is great to see. I've always been wondering what happened to Putin's plan to resettle a lot of Afrikaners. I do know a few thousand of them made it to southern Russia, so that's real, but it appears that Trump is doing his own version of this. I don't know where these Afrikaners would go live, but unlike other African immigrants and refugees, these are some people that, frankly, I'd love to see them move into my neighborhood because they're some of the hardest working people in their diasporas. They're high earners. And again, this obviously we weren't talking about enough people to really do any kind of replacement even in local regions where they are coming from. But we've seen a lot of people, Eric Arvol has gone to Orania recently, and we of course support the Orania project. We love to talk to some people who work on that project in the future. But yeah, in general, obviously South Africa, member of BRICS, so being aggressive against it from a U.S. interest perspective isn't always necessarily based, but this is very much a respectable position. And I hope that, again, people always complain that 70% of the land in South Africa is owned by the white Afrikaners and how that's unfair. But look what happens in Zimbabwe, former Rhodesia. The authorities there are begging, Robert Mugabe are begging the white people to come back and farm the land because they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it properly. They don't know how to cycle the crops properly. The land doesn't become as good anymore. It gets worn down. And if you do the same thing in South Africa, it's going to be the exact same way. So let them farm, let things go on. At this point, we got to hope for some kind of northern or Cape independence, perhaps with Orania as the capital of a newly Balkanized area of South Africa that's actually for the Afrikaners, which we know would rapidly become the nicest place in all of Africa to live. But moving on from Africa, we've got to discuss some church news. And if you have any news, of course, about the ongoing persecutions in Ukraine, Dimitri, let's hear it.
Oh, yeah, of course. The Metropolitan of Alexandria, and mind you, you'll be like, hold on, you mean Patriarch? No. Metropolitan Bogolyub of Alexandria in Ukraine, his member of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, one of the hierarchs, has released a video. He was a really stand-up metropolitan, sort of speaking out against persecutions for a long time, but he said that we really, as Orthodox Christians, even, and he's saying this from a place where the church is literally persecuted, but he's still paying attention to sort of Orthodox news around the world. And he's saying that this Easter in 2025, we really need to pay close attention as Orthodox Christians to what Patriarch Bartholomew and Pope Francis will be doing if they will potentially enact some sort of project to unite Orthodox and Roman Catholic Easters together, sort of take the Orthodox Greeks entirely and those on the DEP entirely off of the Julian calendar Easter. So he said, let's pay really close attention to this sort of degenerate ecumenism that will take place later this year. Very interesting. Even Ukrainian hierarchs who are under constant pressure from the government and from all these various Banderat militias are still paying attention. There's no excuse for us to be pro-ecumenist when even the people literally in danger are still paying attention and warning their flock, even in Ukraine, which again really shows his devotion to orthodoxy. But it's really interesting, this from the village of WWIII in Ivano-Frankivsk. This is far western Ukraine next to Lvov. So as you can imagine, a very heavy, deep Banderite home territory. There was a small parish church and they released this video address. Essentially, the camera was sort of facing its back to the altar. It filmed the entire church, very small sort of parish, maybe 20, 30 parishioners at most. And the priest leading it, they released a video address to J.D. Vance, the Vice President of the United States, asking him to call Kiev and have at least a 10-minute conversation with the leadership in Kiev to stop the persecution in the United States. And this is one of the many video addresses from all these various Orthodox Christian Ukrainian parishes asking, especially interesting, they address it not to Donald J. Trump, they address it to J.D. Vance because he's openly spoken out about persecution. They know which American politicians and which spokespersons in American politics have protected Orthodox Christian rights in Ukraine. So these Ukrainians, they're not stupid. They're not in any way uneducated. They're not offline. They're very much paying attention, and they are asking for help, not just from the Russians, but also from their Christian brethren abroad as well. So it's very sort of heartwarming to see this connection. I mean, we're all in different parts of the world, but still our hearts sort of beat, and we pray for those Ukrainians still experiencing persecution. I think this is like a very heartwarming message. There was a very powerful presentation given in the Russian Duma. We did see, of course, last week, Patriarch Kirill gave a very interesting sermon to all the members of parliament. The speaker of the Russian of the Russian Duma, as well as Minister Tolstoy and many others regarding the Antichrist. And this week we had the leading archpriest Dmitry Vasilenko, the leading military priest of the Russian SMO. He's the most experienced military priest, I would say, after Oleg Stinyaev, who served as military priest during the Chechen campaigns, one of the first military priests in the post-Soviet Russian history, because as we know, there were no military priests in the Soviet army. Surprise, surprise, even during the Second World War. But this particular archpriest, Dmitry, he gave a big speech to the Duma, and he explained what the role of the Orthodox priests is in the SMO, that there are close to 1,000 priests who have served at some point in the Russian army, confessing, communing, baptizing, catechizing Orthodox Christian troops, and how important the Russian Orthodox Christian ethic and morality is to actually supporting the state of mind as well as the well-being, spiritually speaking, and even physically, of the Russian troops. The particular teachings of the church prevent Russian troops from committing the various war crimes. They prevent them from marauding. They're at least aiding them in understanding the purpose of the war itself is to protect one's neighbor. It's not to win over the enemy. It's not to kill as many Ukrainians as possible. And he gave this particular speech, and he contrasted the upbringing of the Russian troops under the guidance of these Orthodox Christian priests to the mercenaries brought in from the West, from various Western countries, these low IQ degenerates essentially coming to hunt Slavs in these far eastern lands. Similar, of course, to all the Bolsheviks and communists who would travel all around Africa, like Che Guevara, essentially fighting against various regimes promoting communism. The mercenaries are traveling to Ukraine to promote degeneracy. And he also said that what the NATO staff, members of staff, and military officers are teaching these Ukrainian troops is very diametrically opposed. And he said that even the war crimes committed by the Ukrainian troops can only be explained by one thing, and that's that the Orthodox Christian priests are not present amongst the Ukrainian troops. So even if there are Orthodox Christian canonical troops and conscripts within the Ukrainian military, they do not, unfortunately, have that spiritual backing that can, of course, guide them towards better conduct in this fiery heat, especially on the front lines when all your emotions are brought to a heightened state. And again, the propensity for all kinds of, anti-human actions are, of course, amplified. And we know that, well, there are all kinds of demons present on the front lines, promoting bloodshed, vengeance, etc. And it's really good that at least an archpriest of this particular status, he had all kinds of medals on his chest. He probably has been wounded in the past. This very experienced man gives a speech to the Russian parliamentarians to push this idea that only through Orthodox Christian morality, ethics, and sticking to the faith very strongly can Russia actually come out on top, and can Russia even proclaim itself as a moral victor in this particular conflict. Because otherwise, this just looks like a very insane civil war that frankly should have commenced perhaps early in 2014 and 15, but now nevertheless Russia is very much deep into it, and victory and of course the liberation of Christians in Ukraine can only be done through through proper Orthodox Christian behavior, not through some sort of neo-Sovietism, which again many very questionable entities are promoting across social media, especially on X and other places, who they claim to be geopolitical experts and pro-Russian, but they're not promoting Orthodox Christian values like Archpriest Dmitry Vasilenko. So a very good presentation in the Duma. And this pushes Russia towards the particular state in which it should be when, again, it needs to face off against the entirety of the Satanic West, hopefully fairly long into the future, so that at least Russia can properly prepare itself. Because as we know, society needs to be transfigured in the Russian Federation before it can take on these massive challenges of, I think, what will be the very hot stage of the Third World War.
No, it's very true. Russia, they're on the world island. So unlike the United States, which the prophecies say its real issue will be natural disasters, Russia will face, I think, major bombing campaigns from all sides, ultimately, when things start to happen. But speaking of Russia's revitalization, this is from Bellum Acta. It says, for the first time, a region of the Russian Federation, in a blow to Lenin's legacy, they want to completely ban women from having abortions. In the Vologda region, they intend to discuss a complete ban on abortions, including private clinics. So this is really good to see. The issue will be considered in February at a major meeting in the regional government. Governor Georgy Filimonov said, thus such a thing is the first major victory for the Orthodox and pro-life movements in Russia. So this is some really great stuff. We can pray for that. I know some very active pro-life activists in Russia, and they are really making a lot of progress. So America and Russia were both making moves against abortion. This is the kind of cross-Pacific unity that we can embrace, right? Going against abortion, going against the gays. The state of Idaho, the legislature has put forward a motion to challenge Obergefell versus Hodges, get it sent up to the Supreme Court to have gay marriage overturned at the national level in the United States, which would be amazing if that went through. But we got to move on to some other church news, of course, some amazing news out of Romania. They officially canonized the new 16 saints, mostly from suffering under the communist yoke. The new letter said that in the 20th century, the Orthodox people honored with great devotion the confessor priests and great spiritual fathers who, in the harsh times of the communist period, preached the faith in God with great courage. This is from the Romanian Patriarchate. And some of these people, I'm not going to read all of them, but some of you may know, of course, Father Dimitri Staniloae, now Saint Dimitri Staniloae, one of the greatest 20th century theologians. We have Arsenius of Prilep, Arsenie Boca, a very amazing ascetic and prophet. We had Elder Cleopas, who, of course, many people are aware of. We had, of course, a whole bunch of other new martyrs that suffered under the communist regime. But I wanted to read some brief prophecies from Arsenie Boca, who was, of course, just canonized, which are very relevant to the World War Now sort of lexicon here. This is from the Icon and Light blog. It says, Arsenie Boca also warned that in the final days, religions would become more and more interested in ecumenism. He said that this would be one of the greatest heresies of all time. Father Arsenie prophesied the end of communism, But he also warned of what would come next. The red scum, the hammer and sickle, the five-pointed star will disappear. But after that, the six-pointed star will come, and there will be anarchy, referring to a future Jewish rule over the world, since the hexagram known as the Star of David is used only by them in the state of Israel. He also said that the devil is working on corrupting people and destroying the world since the ancient times, and its primary goal is to control and dominate the entire world. He goes on saying the world will focus on Romania for a short period of time because there will be changes and specific signs in this country which are outside of material understanding. On Christmas Day of 1989, Romanians overthrew their communist government by executing the dictator Ceausescu and his family, just as the prophet said. The military also opened fire on protesters, killing a total of 1,104 people and injuring 3,300. Arsenie Boca said that after the revolution, many will leave Romania and migrate to foreign countries, but few of them will ever return. However, the time will come when all of them will want to return, but no one will be able to because Romania will be surrounded by fire. The prophecy goes on with Father Arsenius warning that in one day Romania will be occupied by 3 foreign countries, Hungary, Bulgaria, and Russia. A rain of fire will fall over those who occupied us. Bucharest will become the second Jerusalem. What he meant was that Bucharest will be wiped just like Jerusalem, and no stone will be left on top of the other stone. But the prophet goes on, comforting those who are panicked, saying that Virgin Mary herself will be on her knees praying to God for Romania's forgiveness. Father Arsenius said that we are living in the final times and that Romania's capital city, Bucharest, will be wiped off the face of the planet by fire. Father Arseni prayed for the salvation of Americans, saying to God, God, please do not punish the Americans. Please forgive them and have mercy on them. They too are your creation. But God took his spirit to America, and he was shown how America really is. After that, Father Arseni said, yes, God, they are worthy of destruction. Shortly after this, he painted what he was shown at the Dragonescu Church, New York City's skyline with the World Trade Center on fire. Thus, he prophesied the terrorist events of 9/11. So, pretty amazing things there. And what he said about the Romanians leaving Romania is happening as we speak. The Romanian diaspora in Europe is the largest Orthodox diaspora, becoming one of the largest Orthodox diasporas in the world. Because of that, Orthodoxy is the fastest growing religion in Italy. It's an extremely fast growing religion in Scotland, even in the UK, because so many Romanians are going there. And a lot of these parishes are having converts, converting local Westerners to their parish. So amazing to hear. And of course, Saint Arsenius, pray for us, pray for Romania, pray for the resolution of the ongoing Third World War, and that especially my nation, America, would repent so that we might not face the wrath that perhaps Father Arsenius was shown that we deserve. So a bunch of amazing saints. Be sure to read all about them. A lot of them get called fascists by the usual suspects, the usual philo-Semitic characters, because many of these people were sympathetic to Codreanu. They were members of the Iron Guard. And of course, they all suffered under communist Jewish persecution in these prisons. So be sure to ask these new saints for their intercessions and look into them and read about their lives, because they are wonderful men. And our final piece of news from the church here has to do with the new Antiochian monastery in Tennessee. The abbot of that monastery, or the head of it, schema monk Paul, he is in Balamond Monastery now, where Metropolitan Saba will be ordaining him a deacon, and then the next day, Patriarch John will be ordaining him to the priesthood, and he will then be leading the first, really truly established Antiochian monastery in America, which will start receiving visitors after this year's Pascha. So Axios, many years to the new, about to be new Father Paul by the time you all are listening to this. This is going to be really good for the Antiochian Americans, and I believe Father Paul is a monk in a very traditional Athonite affectation, so I think he will be a very positive influence on the church here, and perhaps in the future he may even be elevated to the rank of bishop, but I highly doubt he would want that for himself. But before we send everybody off here, I did miss one brief thing we do have to mention. Russ Vought, for example, one of Trump's appointees, he was just confirmed as the OMB director, the Office of Management and Budget, which is a more obscure role, but is very important. And I only bring this up because later this week, we might get a final answer on if RFK and Tulsi Gabbard are confirmed in the Senate. And unfortunately, John Fetterman, the man who can't ever seem to get the heart up to put anything on besides a hoodie, his hoodie and basketball shorts look, he says that he will not be voting for RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard. So these ones may be coming down to another 50-50 vote split where J.D. Vance has to come in and put the hammer down and get these people through. But Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., they're some of the more relevant and important picks for the agenda, so we really hope they can get through. But Russ Vought at OMB is really good. Russ Vought is an open Christian nationalist. He's openly against homosexual marriage, abortion, against a lot of women's rights stuff even. He's pretty hardcore. So it's good to see him there, and we can hope that he can make somewhat of a difference. Unfortunately, even Tulsi Gabbard, I don't necessarily see her making as much of a difference on the Israel front as we might have hoped. RFK Jr., of course, we know, was hanging out with Rabbi Shmuley on the campaign, but he's at HHS. We can hope that he can actually start to, make America healthy again. But with all of that, thank you all so much for listening. Please check out the Ether Hour episode this week with George McMillan. It's going to be linked down below. Get behind that paywall to hear all of that, as well as get behind the paywall, of course, to hear all 65 plus of our other Ether Hour episodes, some amazing guests. Gregory Hears, we've had Jim Jatras on, Father John Whiteford, Abbot Trefon, a whole bunch of guests. So be sure to click the link down below and support the show. With all of that, worldwarnow.co, that is where you can find all of this stuff. That is our Substack. That is our home base. That is where the magic happens, as it were. Obviously, subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, World War Now. Follow us on X, World War Now _. Follow me on there at Gnomrad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. You can find us also on Apple Podcasts and Spotify if that is your preferred method of listening. But yeah, find us on all those socials. We are posting all the time. Be sure to join the World War Now Discord. We'll have that linked below if you're a paid subscriber. There are paid channels where you can talk to us and other paid subscribers in a more exclusive environment. And Dimitri and I are planning on doing some exclusive voice chats in there in the future as well. So be sure to check all of those things out. Check out the recent Ether Hours. It's all linked below. Thank you again to all the supporters for keeping this possible. And Dimitri, I will leave you with the last word.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Super weak. And thank you for everyone for your support. We've been getting boosted in the algorithm quite massively. So keep liking the videos. It's the least you can do, especially if you're a paid subscriber. We really appreciate your support. And of course, keep the people of Lebanon, Palestine, Syria, Russia, Ukraine in your prayers, because all these lands and the people therein have been selected by the global Talmudic cabal as the first victims, I think, of the Third World War. And I think these are the places where the enemies of mankind have selected their main victims, and they will be the places where the Third World War will unfortunately kick off. So keep all these innocent people in your prayers because they really need it. And thank you, everyone, for your support. I think the show has been doing very well. It's been an awesome 2025 so far.
Thank you guys, and God bless. We'll see you on the next one.